few years ago. It was actually it was a different world, but it was at a time, let's say shortly after Lincoln was assassinated. I was in high school in Brooklyn, and I remember having a discussion with a Jew who subsequently became a great Talmid Chacham. He was a classmate of mine, Rabbi Cohen, and we were discussing the mechanics of making difficult decisions in life. And he quoted a scholar. He didn't at the time say who it was, subsequently I found out. But he quoted a scholar as having said, you have a difficult decision to make in life, go through the mock scenario as if you're making the decision for your son, not for yourself. Make believe you have a son. And then, what would you tell your son if he came to ask you this dilemma? How would you help guide him? Whatever you would tell your son is what you should do. Now, why would you think, I'm throwing it out, why would you think that that might be more effective than just thinking what's the right thing to do? Why is it more effective if you think about it for your son?
Because then you'll think about it for your future.
I'm sorry?
Then you'll think about it for your future.
You'll think about the future.
Yeah.
You think long range.
Yeah.
Whereas you're thinking for yourself, you're going to think short range, to relax the tension, the anxiety that you feel, because that's an immediate urgency that people want to get out of tension. And when you think you escape a little bit and you take a longer view, as he said, then, and that's an exercise that helps you take a longer view. When you think, what would I tell my son if he came to ask me this question? That's what you should do. I asked him at the time, this friend, Rabbi Cohen, he should be starken gesund. I asked him what's the source. He didn't have a source for it, but he just quoted this Chacham, who turned out to be the Rosh Yeshiva in the yeshiva under whom we were studying, Rav Hutner, Zechet Tzaddik Livrocha. And years later, I found the source, and as often happens when you have a learning relationship with somebody, so shortly after I found that source, I was walking in the street in Yerushalayim, must have been 40, maybe 50 years after we had had that discussion, and I met Reb Feivel in the street, and I said, you remember that question? We were looking for the source. I have the source, right? And he was right on the same page with me where we had left off. This week's Parsha starts with a invitation, halachic responsibility for Kohanim to maintain a certain level of sanctity which is beyond the norm. It's not what Klal Yisrael has to maintain. It's special for Kohanim because they have a special mission. There's a repetition in the language in the verse in the Parsha, Emor Kohanim ve'omarta. And again it says, and you should say to them. So Rashi quotes Chazal, quotes the Talmud as saying that this is to give responsibility for the adults to watch the children, that they shouldn't mess up in their maintaining this special level of sanctity, the children that are Kohanim. The Dubne Magid on that verse and on that Rashi quotes two Gemaras. One, the Gemara appears twice. One time it says son, and one time it says grandson. Once in Brochas, once in Kedushin. The Gemara says, whoever teaches his son Torah or his grandson Torah, it's comparable to that child receiving the Torah at Sinai. Says the Dubna Mag, what does it mean? It's not just hyperbole. It's not just a very dramatic way of presenting something. There's some message here. If Chazal use that as the analogy, there must be some message there. Says the Dubna Maggid, what was the state of affairs at Sinai? We're taught that they had reached such a level of spiritual elevation that had they not subsequently sinned, then there would never have been any more forgetting. All the Torah they learned, it was the language of Chazal is posku ze'umosam, they lost their Yetzer Hara. Okay, so then there's an obvious question then, how could they subsequently fall so quickly with the golden calf? Fine, we'll always have to say that there's a certain level of challenge in relation to where you're at, otherwise there's no point in continuing to struggle, to prove yourself. So there has to be a certain amount of tension built in. So the struggle, the challenge had to continue some way, and it's on a different level, it's moved to a different playing field. But there was a moment there, and maybe it was the moment right before, that they had transcended earthly urgencies. They were now transported to a new level of existence where they learned Torah, it was integrated into their personality, and they would not have forgotten it. I submit that that's the source, because the Gemara is teaching us that when you teach your son or you teach your grandson Torah, you are then transported to a level of being beyond the id, being beyond the evil inclination. It's a moment as if two angels are learning, beyond human limitations. You've broken out of the box, you crashed through the ceiling. So that's what it means. It's a moment of truth. There's a moment of special truth when you teach your son or you teach your grandson, which is, anytime you're giving advice, it's a lesson of sorts. So that is a source for us, that when teaching one's son, one then moves to another dimension or grandson. Okay. Let's look at the Rambam in the Laws of Talmud Torah. In the Laws of Talmud Torah, the Rambam says there's a mitzvah to teach your son Torah. And he quotes a verse. It's a mitzvah to teach your grandson. There's a mitzvah to teach all Jews. Have a mitzvah to teach Torah to everybody. And the verses that are quoted all use a reference of children, but grandchildren are also called children, and says the Rambam, your students are called your children. It's a kind of spiritual birth. We have other sources for that. We have in the Torah that Moshe, that he taught Torah to Klal Yisrael, he taught to his sons, he taught to...
Why is it only, why is it only talking about sons?
Why does it start with sons? That's going to be my question. Why does it present it in a? But that's the way we are introduced to the mitzvah of Talmud Torah, is first teach your son, then teach your grandson, then teach all of Klal Yisrael, and all of Klal Yisrael are called your sons. And we have sources, other sources for that as well, that we have in Chumash, that all of Klal Yisrael were like the children, the sons of Aaron, because they learned Torah from Moshe, are also like the sons of Moshe. Okay. The Rambam quotes a verse from the prophets, B'nei HaNeviim, which really means Klal Yisrael, the Jewish people, like as if they were the sons of the Nevi'im, the sons of the prophets, they were students, disciples of the prophets, but they're treated as if they're sons. But his question is where I was going. Why would we have to go this way to learn first about son, especially since the Rambam then says, only after he says son, grandson, all of the Jewish people, then lastly the Rambam says, and just like you're obligated to teach your son, your grandson, and all Klal Yisrael, you are obligated to teach yourself Torah. Now, that's not the way I would have structured it. I assume you would have started with your mitzvah. You have a mitzvah to learn, start with your mitzvah. Then you go out and teach others, even if the other is a son or a grandson. But, and the Rambam uses a peculiar, you have to always factor in that we're very exact in our interpretation of the language of a verse, but not just of a verse, of the Talmud and of a commentary, especially the early commentaries, that they're very, very calibrated, the diction, the syntax, and that there's no extra or accidental phrasing. That there's a message that's being taught. And the Rambam says, kishem, in the same manner that you are obligated to teach your son, you're obligated to teach yourself. If I was writing that, and it was simply a direct obligation to teach me that I have to learn Torah, I would say, you have an obligation to learn Torah. What does he say? Just like you have an obligation to teach your son, you have an obligation to teach yourself. Learn. Why do it in a convoluted way? Why say it that way? And it's not accidental that the Rambam says it that way. He has some message there.
But how can we teach Torah? How can we teach other people before you teach Torah yourself? And then if you don't know any of the stuff, you can't transmit it.
Excellent question. But it means that you didn't necessarily do it because it was your mitzvah yet. Let's say chronologically, you got it. Your father taught you. So you're carrying around that cargo of X amount of Torah, which you weren't prompted to do because you yourself had a mitzvah at that point in time. And that's one simple reading. The Rambam is going with the chronology of how things would go if everything was in place. But the problem with that is that there's a continuing mitzvah that I have to learn Torah. And the Rambam even gets into a very interesting discussion of what if there's only enough resources, there are only enough resources for either me to learn or my son to learn. So who gets priority and how do you decide that? That's discussion. You'll ask your Rabbeim to take a look in the text and the Rambam, very interesting discussion. Okay, for our purposes, just following our theme, what I would like to suggest is that the Rambam is reinforcing the proposition that we began with. The Rambam is saying that any time you learn Torah, look at the text as if you were teaching this text to your son. That will always be the ultimate litmus test for evaluating how objectively I'm reading it and how deeply and sensitively I am incorporating it into my person. You've already had some exposure to Talmud. You understand that any kind of complex material can have various interpretations. And we work, interestingly enough, we work with all of the realities of human personality. Human being has ego. Human being has a need for aesthetic satisfaction. We try and harness that and sublimate it. We don't deny the existence of those realities, we sublimate them into competition for learning so that each of us should learn more, quantitatively and qualitatively. The language of the Emor is that the competition between scholars increases scholarship. Healthy. But there's a danger there. There's also a danger there, is that you can get stuck in a position because of the competitiveness, and you climbed out on a limb and you don't want to come down. The Rambam in the Guide to Perplex says that often, if you analyze, there are three prime reasons why people confuse arguments and are mistaken. One is lack of aptitude. They just can't handle any argument that needs concentration. Two is lack of information. So mistakes are often made for one of those two reasons. But there's a third reason. The third reason is investment, that you have an unconscious agenda, that you got stuck in a certain position. I don't know if I've ever thrown out the idea to you fellas, but over the years, sometimes I've put this case forward. Somebody comes in, totally secular person, and he's been told that here's a system that has something to offer about life, about truth, and you've got to make an evaluation. Does it work or doesn't it work? Objectively and subjectively. So if a guy's been exposed to the frum world, he already knows enough to know that there are certain expectations of certain things to do and certain things not to do. And we call the organization of that in its legislative body, we call that Shulchan Aruch. Right? The Shulchan Aruch, the code of law, idiomatically translated, Shulchan Aruch means the set table. Right? A few hundred years ago, there was a consensus of endorsement of the halachic authorities of the time to award that recognition of collating all of the positions over the years and putting them into that was the Beis Yosef, the Emor for certain communities that had modifications of certain of those decisions, but the bulk is Shulchan Aruch, and the Emor is incorporated, and the ultimate complement of the Emor to the Beis Yosef, to the Rabbi Yosef Cairo, is how few are his emendations compared to the total body. But when we say Shulchan Aruch, we mean the two together. So Shulchan Aruch, a guy comes into Osameach, he just parachuted in, right, from UCLA campus, and right, the weather is great all the time. By the way, I once thought that you'll find more cults and sects and unusual behavior in California and in places with weather like California, because the human spirit needs changes of season. And when you don't have changes, there's a certain spiritual and psychological ennui that sets in that creates a need to change and to create change, not to discover it, to invent it. Okay, that's there was an actor. I never saw any of his films, but he visited Osameach, Potemkin, Jewish actor. Anyway, he came to my home for Shabbos one time with his wife, and they said they agreed with the, I don't think it meant anything to them, but they agreed with the, okay. So, guy comes in, and now he parachutes into Osamer, and he already knows that there's such a thing as tzitzis, there's kosher, there's Shabbos. So now, at this point in time, he hasn't heard Rabbi Breidowitz, he hasn't heard Rabbi Gottlieb, he hasn't heard Osamer's GBS. Who was GBS in Western literature? Not Yitzhak. Anybody else? Who was GBS? George Ben Asher. Okay. So for most of you, like I keep reminding you, you knew that before you came to Osamer, or you found out about that in Osamer?
Found out about the acronym.
Okay. So if you want to improve your secular education, it's a good place to start, is at Osamer. So GBS is the fellow who said, by the way, he was a definitely, unequivocally anti-Semite, Semitic in his, a lot of stuff he said and did. He was a nasty guy. But he's also the guy who's credited with the line, those who can do, those who can't teach. And our addendum to that was, those who can't teach, teach teachers. And those who can't teach teachers write textbooks. Okay, so that's a Western take on which a lot of people bought into. We make a brocha every morning, Birkas HaTorah, blessings on Torah, because we're working from a premise that is God-given the Torah. And we say that the Ribbon Shalom, God is Hamalamed Torah la'amo Yisrael. God teaches Torah to the Jewish people, because no matter how smart you are, even if you have the criteria that the Rambam put in place, you need siyata d'shmaya, you need assistance from the Ribbon Shalom, that everything should work and everything should fall into place. You're not in control. You have to take responsibility for your life as if you are in control, full while knowing that you're not in control. And the Ribbon Shalom brings success. But you have to do everything that would bring to that success. It's a fascinating, right, tension that the Jew lives with. Mordechai says to Esther, she's now aware of the fact that the Jews are under threat. Go in and pitch for the Jewish people. She says the rules of the house are, the protocol of the king is that he has to initiate the invitation. I can't go, I'm risking my life. He says, if you don't do it, the Jews will be saved by some other agency. But you and your family won't be saved. So I ask you, he's asking her to risk her life. Is that the way to persuade her? Shouldn't he say to her just the opposite? He should say to her, Esther, you're the only one that can do it. Therefore, you have to risk your life. He says, no, the Jews will be saved some other way. What is the answer? The answer is Mordechai is telling her the truth. I first heard this idea expressed from an erstwhile friend, Reb Noach Weinberg, subsequently, we agreed about a lot of things, but we disagreed about a lot of things. But it's a well-taken point. I'm not sure if he quoted it from somebody or it was his own understanding, but it screams from the verse. Screams from the verse that is the eternal paradox that the Jew lives with. Do it as if you are the only one that can get it done, full well knowing that I can't succeed without God making it happen. Okay, so now we're coming back. There's a Shulchan Aruch. In the Shulchan Aruch, we work with ego. We sublimate it. But before that exquisite tension is resolved in sublimating the aesthetic, the ego, right, then they demand to be satisfied. So everybody has an agenda. And he says, wait a minute. I'm going to go listen now to the GBS of Or Sameach, the Gottlieb, Breidowitz, and Schiller of Or Sameach. That's Or Sameach's GBS, right? And we disagree with GBS. We say that to teach is emulating God, and because God teaches Klal Yisrael, and that's where we get the Torah from. Do we have to treat it as if it's totally up to us? Yes. But ultimately it's a gift from the Rebbeinu Shalom. So before guys heard this GBS, why should he expose himself to it? Things were great, right? The weather, the spiritual climate out there in LA was great. Right? What's he missing? What's this gnawing? Especially now he's being told that, wait a minute, these guys have an agenda. If you buy into their metaphysical system, there's tzitzis, there's kosher, there's Shabbos. Now, parenthetically, anybody who is from or has tasted being from would make the case this is a way to enjoy life better. It's a greater sense of fulfillment, besides the question of truth and falsity. It's a way to enjoy life better. But somebody standing on the outside as a spectator can't necessarily be expected to believe that. He knows that something is missing by him, but why should he yet believe that you're enjoying it better? He may pick up on it if he visits enough from families, picks up on the vibes in the home, the children, relationship between spouses. He can't pick up that there's something different here. There's some qualitative difference. But what he knows is what he's giving up, right? That cheeseburger is waiting at McDonald's. Make believe, I suggest, that when you're going to make this difficult decision, this existential decision about is this stuff possibly or probably true, I don't think you can come to a firm conclusion that it is absolutely true until you're immersed in learning. And the immersion in learning creates a certain reality that transcends any other argument that you might have heard. Because arguments, there's always at least an unconscious suspicion that there's a possibility maybe somebody that's more clever than me might rebut it. But there comes a time, I'll tell you what I like to, my analogy. Most people who could appreciate a Beethoven symphony, I'm not talking about people who cannot appreciate the Beethoven symphony. Let's say most people who can would want to make the case that Beethoven's Ninth Symphony is a better, that's an electrically charged word, better piece of music than Pop Goes the Weasel. Now, a fellow who cannot appreciate Beethoven's Ninth Symphony was it. All you can say is you like it better, and I like Pop Goes the Weasel better. So really, if he's trying to persuade him, it's a difficult task. All he can say is the quantity of relationships of sounds and the complexity of the interaction between those sounds in the Beethoven's piece produces a greater aesthetic satisfaction for somebody who can get to the point of appreciating that. So it's a quantitative statement. To make the leap from quantity to quality is a leap, a step, but there's a difference. So there's a certain point that most people will be willing to grant that there's certain quantitative relationships that constitute qualitative differences. So I would suggest that you can hear arguments and discussions which will create more than possibilities. I think we can get to probabilities. But to get beyond probability to an absolute reality, when you daven, you don't daven to a probability. You daven to a reality. That has to come from your personal engagement with the learning and certain consistency of the quantity of insights interacting with each other begin to constitute a qualitative difference. And it's not just another clever piece of literature. It's different. And it somehow spills over into life. And it works. And it creates families and communities. I remember Rav Bullman's Zera Tzaddik L'Bracha once said to somebody who was purportedly a student of Bible criticism. Of course, it turned out that he didn't know the Bible, but that's a separate issue. Don't confuse me with the facts, right? Rav Bullman said to him, "Take me to your community. Where's your people? Where's your nation?" We say not only does this hang together intellectually, but it works. It works in a way that creates what you see around you. Is it flawless? No, absolutely not. Who was the last of the 400 hitters? No? Where are the Americans in the room? Ted Williams. Since then, nobody hit 400. It's only 4 out of 10. The batting average in the Frum community, do we have our strikeouts? Yeah. But our batting average, on the average, is much higher. And therefore, it's the team that I would prefer playing with. The consistency. Less errors in the field, more runs scored. So it makes sense that I should give a priority to experimenting with that. So somebody's about to hear lectures and he's about to make an evaluation. How seriously should I take this? But unconsciously he's running a risk. What's the risk? Wait a minute. If I buy into this stuff, they're going to say, wait a minute, you got to put on tzitzis, you got to keep Shabbos, you can't eat that McDonald's cheeseburger. So at least unconsciously and often consciously, does he have an agenda? Yes. Now, people have asked me over the years, yeah, but there's a problem. The problem is that everybody in Osamech is so nice to them, so doesn't that create an opposite agenda that they'd like to think that this is true? So, of course, my first response is that I'll show you the memos. I keep sending memos to staff, to faculty at Osamech, that they should be obnoxious to the students. But they don't listen. Right? What can I do? The most we will ever do is to create a counterbalancing force, because everybody knows, even kids that grow up in the Frum community, right? All they have to do is walk in the streets. The beach has come to the streets, right? Everybody has peripheral vision. So there's a constant challenge and test, and people know that they're paying a price, but it's worth it. Why is it worth it? Probability, if we get that far. I think we can, probability. But the transition to the next step takes a certain amount of courage. What's the courage? The courage is that I may wind up. I remember in it was the '67 war. They had that. Everybody was very enamored with Israel at the time. Of course, fashion has changed in the left-wing circles, but at the time, Israel was a great hero. They had a picture of a Haredi Jew, in secular papers, in a Superman costume, right, going out there. But remember Superman? Clark Kent, Superman, right? So I've always visualized that most families whose sons come to Osameach sent them here as Superman, and all of a sudden he goes into a phone booth and he comes out like Clark Kent with a hat and a jacket. I once, when I was still in attendance at Brooklyn College, Brooklyn was a great school in those days. It had very high academic standards, and it was called the poor man's Harvard. It was competitive to get in there, at least not to pay. And I was taking some classes that involved a lot of philosophy, and we would have discussions between classes in the cafeteria. Later, Brooklyn College, great growth of the Torah community, and a lot of yeshiva bochum came on. But in those years, there wasn't that much. Subsequently, it was possible to find a lot of minyanim for mincha, ma'ariv. These were afternoon and evening classes. That time it wasn't, so if I had to daven mincha, sometimes I would jump into a phone booth. And I remember the Jews in the group, it was a secular group, Jews and non-Jews. I was the only fellow with the yarmulke. The Jews in the group would be very sarcastic about my stopping to daven mincha. The Goyim were very, very respectful. They would say to me, put in a good word for me, right? And the Jews would say, did you get a busy signal? Why? Why would you think the Jews would be more sarcastic on the average than the non-Jews? Because when I stand up to daven mincha, I didn't say anything to them, come join me. But implied in my act is that I think a Jew should daven mincha. So there was an unconscious challenge and resistance on the part of the Jew. Just the mere fact of my davening, I didn't say anything to them. I said, excuse me, I'm doing my thing. The non-Jew had no problem with it. Okay, so somebody's evaluating the system, he's a spectator from without, and wait a minute, I'm going to look like those guys with the hats and jackets, I'm going to look like Clark Kent. I want to stay as Superman. It takes a certain amount of courage. What's the courage? The courage is to be objective. Right? Is it right or isn't it right? Is it true or isn't it true? Part of the decision-making process can be facilitated as we make incremental steps along the way. And life goes that way. It's not just one major dramatic decision with like a Cecil B. DeMille production with music in the background and all kinds of flashing pictures on the screen. It's incremental, little step and a little step and a little step. But each step that you take, it is helpful. If my son came to me and asked me, what should I do now? Should I do this or shouldn't I do this? Should I learn more and take this risk or shouldn't I? What would you tell your son? What you would tell your son is what you should do. I'll end with this. The Torah Jew works from a premise, let's call it Talmudic psychology has it, that human beings are psychological, not logical. Since we are made up, the landscape of human personality has emotions and physiology, they never go away, they're always at work. That's why our challenge is sublimation. How do we find a way? We don't deny any reality, it's sublimating it, which is a long discussion elsewhere. Maybe some of you heard me tell a story, and this is the final. Freud was convinced that there's a Jewish humor, which is unique to Jews, and according to Theodor Reich, who was his prime disciple, the following was Freud's favorite story. A Jew is admitted to an insane asylum. First day he's there, he demands kosher food. They don't have the ability to provide the kosher food. He goes into a temper tantrum, a hunger strike. There's only one Jewish doctor. They ask him to persuade this Mr. Schwartz to relent. Can't. They have to bus in food from a distant facility. Costly, till they can reorganize, either sending him somewhere else or to get in some kosher food. Come Shabbos, the first Shabbos, the doctor's walking around the grounds of the hospital and he sees Mr. Schwartz on a reclining chair, a lawn chair, smoking a big cigar. He runs over to him and he says, Schwartz, you made me miserable demanding kosher food. Now you sit there smoking a cigar on Shabbos? To which Schwartz replies, remember, doctor, I'm crazy. That, gentlemen, is the Talmudic definition of sin. Sin is a moment, an aberrational moment of temporary insanity. If we were plugged in to evaluating the cheeseburger and eternity on the other side of the scale, unlikely that's what we would tell our sons, and unlikely that that's what's good for us.